Hello YouTube, I'm Pedro from the Wicked Cat team and I'm here to present you the first video on Unity 5 terrain tools. If you enjoyed this video, remember to leave a like, and if you want more Unity 5 tutorials, remember to subscribe to our channel. Now, to start, let's create a brand new scene. Go to Menu, File, and now select New Scene. As you can see, Unity will create a new scene with two game objects, the main camera and a directional light. One difference between Unity 4 and Unity 5 is that on this new version of Unity, the engine will automatically add a skybox to your scene. Now, in order to add a terrain game object, go to the Game Object menu and select Terrain. This will create a flat plane into your scene, as you can see. This plane is the mesh that we are going to sculpt in order to create your level terrain. Now, this is an asset that can be found on the base directory of your project. So if I select the assets from the project tab, I can see that Unity created a new terrain asset and place it right here. Now, first things first. Now that we have a terrain game object, let's take a look at the inspector. As you can see, the terrain has three components: the default transform component, a terrain script component, and a terrain collider component. The terrain collider is used to detect collisions with other game objects. Now, the one that we are going to focus on this video series is the terrain component, that will provide you the tools to sculpt and create your terrain. All the tools on the toolbar, with the exception of the tree placement tool and the settings panel, provide a set of brushes and settings for brush size and opacity, just like tools from an image editor. As you can see, you have several brushes that you can select from, and you can apply them into the mesh of the terrain. Now, this blue area that you see on the scene view is the area affected by the brush. Just like I told you before, on the tree and on the settings you don't have a brush. Now, as you may have realized by now, the terrain is quite big. So in order to navigate through the scene on the Scene tab, press the right button of the mouse to look in different directions, and while holding the right mouse button, you can move on the scenario using the keys W, A, S and D, just like in a game. So this way you can move in the scene. Now, before we start exploring the terrain tools, let's take a look at the terrain properties. You can do this by selecting this last button of the terrain tools. As you can see, the properties of the terrain are divided by section. We have the base terrain section, the tree and detail objects section, the wind setting section, and the resolution section, and the high map section. Let's start by the base terrain. As you can see, the first parameter that you have here is draw. This first option toggles the rendering of the terrain on or off. Right now, draw is on. If I turn it off, the engine will not draw the terrain. Let's turn it on again. Next, you can modify the pixel error value. This value is the accuracy of the mapping between the terrain maps, for example textures and height maps, and the generated terrain. The use of higher values indicate lower accuracy, but lower values will result on rendering overhead. So you can use the slider to select a value, or you can simply write it on the box. However, keep in mind that you need to have a balanced value to your game, because very high value will be faster, but lower value can be too harsh for the rendering. Next, we have the base map distance. This is the maximum distance at which terrain textures will be displayed at full resolution. Like on the last option, you can change the values with the slider or entering directly in the box. Now you can turn cast shadows on or off. Right now we don't have any objects on the scene, like trees for example, so you'll not be able to see the difference, but once we have them, you can select if you want, for example, the trees to cast shadows or not. Next, we have material. Now this is again one difference from Unity 4 to Unity 5. So here you can select the material that is going to be used to render the terrain. This will affect how the color changes of the terrain texture, and this will affect the color channels of the terrain and texture. For this, you can select several options. You can have the default, that is built-in standard, which is physical based rendering material that was introduced in Unity 5. If you select this option, for each slat layer, you can use one texture, albedo and smoothness, one texture for normal and one scalar value to tweak metalness. As you can see, you can turn override smoothness on or off and set a value for smoothness. Also keep in mind that override smoothness is checked instead of reading from texture maps. The smoothness of the entire terrain is controlled only by smooth value. So if we use override smoothness, all the smoothness is controlled by the value you set on smoothness. Next, the other option that you can choose for materials is built-in legacy diffuse. This is the legacy building terrain used on Unity 4. It uses a Lambert lighting model and has an optional normal map support. Next, you have the built-in legacy specular. This built-in material uses a Blingfong lighting model and has optional normal map support. This option also allows you to specify the overall specular color and shyness of the terrain. So you can set this color on this property. This will open at this new window and you can select, for example, red. And you can modify the shyness of the material here. Finally, you can set the material to custom. This material should be a shader that is specialized for terrain rendering. This is an option that we only recommend to advanced users. However, if you want to give it a try, take a look at the source code from some of the Unity built-in terrain shaders and make modifications on top of them. Now you can also, let's before anything change to built-in standard. Okay, so now you can also change the reflection probes used on your terrain. Keep in mind that the reflection probes will only be used when the built-in standard material or in the custom material that supports rendering with reflection. So in this case you can only use the reflection probes on built-in standard or custom. Now for rendering probes we have several options that you can choose from. You can set them to off, meaning that reflection probes are disabled and only the skybox will be used for reflection. You can select blend probes, meaning that reflection probes are enabled. The blending occurs only between probes. Default reflection will be used if there are no reflection probes nearby, but there will be no blending between default reflection and probe. You also have blend probes and skybox, which means reflection probes are enabled and blending occurs between probes or probes and default reflection. And finally, you have simple. Simple means that reflection probes are enabled, but no bleeding will occur between probes and when there are two overlapping volumes. Moving on, you have the last parameter of the section, which is thickness. This value specifies how much the terrain collision volume should extend along the negative y-axis. Objects are considered colliding with the terrain from the surface to a depth equal to the thickness. This helps to prevent high-speed moving objects from penetrating into the terrain without using the expensive continuous collision detection. So this basically covers the base terrain options for the terrain game object. On the next videos we will explore the remaining sections of the options and then we will move on to sculpting the terrain. It is important that we realize all the options we have on the settings before we start changing the terrain, since there are some values that you should fix before trying to create a terrain for your game. For example, if you try to change the resolution section, all the operations you do sculpting the terrain will be reset. So it is important that you set the settings of the terrain first, so that is why we are focusing on this right now. So this concludes our first video on Terrain Editor. Like I said, on the next video we will continue to explore the remaining options. Until then, have a nice day.